All right, so questions I asked in this paper is what drives state social policy, under which conditions do social movements and other hypothesized determinants of policy influence it. And using the case of U.S. old age policy in the 1930s and 1940s. And I have this kind of like a little laundry list of determinants of policy here, and they are structural influences, and this is simply levels of democratization, the nature of the party system, various domestic administrative influences. In some of this literature on the state, you see that the various domestic bureaus may have influence over policy. They're making proposals or making it more likely that a policy will be implemented. You have the role of partisan governments. In most of the, you see the welfare state literature, a lot of the literature indicates that which regime is in power, which government is in power, which party is in power will determine how policy comes out. And then there's some other contenders here, which we've been talking about a little bit already in the conference here. Social movements. Are social movements influential? And public opinion. And so these are my candidates here for influence based on various theories of social movements. Now, the influence of public opinion, we saw a little bit of discussion in Laura's paper here about that, and that there are a few different there's sort of a strong theory and a weak theory of it. I guess the stronger view is that if you have favorable and salient public opinion through public opinion polls, this would be sufficient for change. I think it's associated with maybe Paul Bernstein, among other people. The second one is that favorable public opinion is necessary for movement influence over policy. It is something that Marco, point he has made, maybe he'll disagree that he can be assigned to this view. And then another thing is that favorable public opinion is just epiphenomenal. If we see this in the crafted talk literature, in which policy change itself or governments, what they say will influence public opinion, and so public opinion doesn't influence policy, but the governments themselves influence public opinion, or the change of policy changes, people like it, public opinion changes along with that. And then finally, this is the position I'm now associating with Laura here, is that favorable public opinion is a kind of an inus cause of policy. And what is that, you may be asking yourself? And is this? Don't make me read it to you. But it's an insufficient but non-redundant part of a condition that in itself unnecessary but sufficient for the occurrence of an outcome. And so say if you have an outcome, outcome E can result from the co-occurrence of A and B or the co-occurrence of C and D. A, B, C, and D are all kind of these inus causes. They're part of a cause that's sufficient for the condition to happen, but they're not themselves necessary in general. And so they're kind of a partial solution in this sense. All right, so I'm presenting a few different models here and to try to explain public policy outcomes here. And one is the so-called institutional politics model, and it expects several things to happen at the same time for policy policy changes or policy generosity to occur. And you have to have a kind of a structurally open polity, and by this I mean the polity has to be democratized and the party system be open. That's to say, it's not oriented by patronage, which is a sort of a way that when party politics is set up in order to provide jobs or benefits for the party itself instead of actual programs that the party might produce. And that you would just simply have a kind of you'd have strong domestic bureaucracies that are able to implement policies, and a favorable partisan regime in power. And so this is like the standard kind of responsible parties model to have this going, and then you see the policy change. That's model one. Model two is a political mediation model, and this is a kind of a model that addresses the influence of social movements, and this also has these structurally open polities. And then there are a few different kind of routes that are in which social movements are these type of inus causes. You have challengers that are well mobilized with strong bureaucracies, challengers that are well mobilized with a favorable partisan regime in power. So these things would both be necessary and together sufficient. Or you have the movement itself engaging in extensive assertive political action. And what might that mean?
Well, assertive political action is when movements challenge the prerogatives of institutional political actors. That's to say they endorse or support candidates for office and do this in a very impressive fashion. They may run and win with their own candidates. They may try to override institutional actors with initiatives and referendums. They might litigate in situations where they can to change laws. Let me say a little bit about the case. I'm looking specifically at U.S. old age policy in the 1930s and 40s, and there was a kind of a social movement, a old age pension movement that arose in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and it was the main organization was something called the Townsend Plan. It came about in 1934. Its leader suggested that the government provide $200 a month for everyone who was 60 years and older, so long as they spent the money. And $200, this was, I don't know what this is in pounds now, but it was a lot of money back then. It was more than the average income of that day. And in the height of its membership, it had maybe 1/5 of Americans over 50 years old were joined in these Townsend clubs. Oh, there they are again. As this group was mobilizing, you did see changes in old age policy in the United States. You saw the rise of the Social Security Act of 1935. And among other things, this created a lot of programs, but they created an old age assistance program that provided support for states of the Union, let's say the 50 U.S. states, 48 at that time, to support their own elderly. And in the wake of this act, each state passed legislation, but the generosity and benefits across states varied quite dramatically. And so, and the Townsend Plan itself, which was a kind of like for a national program, it did not actually succeed, so it fails at this time. Old age policy in the Townsend Plan here at 1936 to 1939. The Townsend Plan endorsed members of Congress in 1936 and had a very strong showing in this in the elections also in 1938. In 1938, there were several state-level initiatives to improve old age benefits in different states. In 1939, the old age issue came back up in the United States before Congress, and there was a new Townsend bill again that was going to provide a generous universal pension, more generous than was being paid at the time, and it failed in the House, it failed in the Senate, and ultimately, though, Congress changed the law again and passed some amendments to the Social Security Act that provided a boost to this old age assistance program, made it possible for states to pay more money to elderly Americans. And so then states had to react to whether they would take up these incentives again at this later point in time. All right, so Townsend clubs themselves mobilized differently across different states. Their idea and what they were trying to do and trying to be influential, that they wanted to get about 100 clubs per congressional district. They felt if they did that, they would kind of dominate that state and politics in that area. And you kind of see in some states they really had a lot of clubs per congressional district. A lot of these states, I don't know if anyone knows the geography of the United States, but a lot of them in the West. And for the most part, outside of the polities that were either undemocratized, which were mainly in the South, or were very patronage-oriented, which were mainly in the Midwest and the Northeast. And then you can kind of see at the bottom of the scale here that these states, South Carolina, Virginia, Louisiana, North Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, all in states that were very much under-democratized. They had really high poll taxes, people couldn't vote in elections and so forth. And so, to some extent, the Townsend Plan had a very difficult time mobilizing in these places, where I'm also arguing that they would also not be influential had they mobilized. All right, so data, there are 48 different states. They varied in the generosity of old age benefits. They vary according to the various indicators that they're suggesting would be influential. There were 9 states with poll taxes that prevented everyday people from voting. There were 13 states with significantly patronage-oriented political parties. There were 12 states with extensive domestic administrative powers. That's to say that the executive state bureaucracies had strong powers and were well developed. And across all states, there's variation in partisan regimes and how well the pension movement was mobilized, in the degree to which it engaged in assertive action of the sort I mentioned before. And also public opinion support for generous benefits. And so created a bunch of measures of this, and you can kind of see the structural influences. The democratization measure is connected to this poll tax. If you have a strong poll tax, you're not democratized. If you have patronage-oriented parties, well, that's pretty much says it what it is. And if you combine these together, these are considered to be kind of like obstacles to generous social policy. And in some of the analyses, it will be combined measures. And then there are various measures that are connected to institutional politics. There's the strong administrative capacity measure. There are states that had democratic regimes in power. If you look here, that there are states where the Townsend Plan and the pension movement in general was highly mobilized. There are states that have assertive activity. And finally, there are public opinion influences, states where there was opinion poll support for generous benefits. Gallup took a poll in 1938 that pretty much asked, like, what do you think would be a good pension or old age benefit for people in your state to have? And then they gave a number. So down to 5 minutes here. And here's how these models are. If you look at them in QCA format, that institutional politics model suggests that this is a route to policy generosity, that if you have the absence of obstacles, and if something's in small letters, that it means it's the absence of it. If it's capital letters, it means the presence of it. But you expect a generous policy to happen, lack of obstacles, strong administrative powers, and a democratic regime in power. Political mediation model has these 3 different routes to possible generous policy. Again, the obstacle part is a negative, the absence of it is a required condition. And there are 3 different ways of getting there. 2 with just a movement being well mobilized, and 1 with it engaging in assertive activity. In a previous paper that used CRISP-Sec QCA qualitative comparative analyses, that this is what we basically found. And so you can see the different combinations that resulted in the data supported one or another model. The first one supports basically the institutional politics model, and the other 2 supported the political mediation model. And so there are different kind of routes to get to a generous old age policy, and you can see that really the movement causes were these kind of like Ines type causes, as were partisan regimes. Here are some potential public opinion models in which public support itself should be expected to lead to policy generosity. And then that's the first model. The second model is public support is necessary for generous social policy. And I think this is kind of more in the spirit of models that Marco suggests, where you need kind of a bunch of things to happen at once for a kind of a policy change, or in my case, policy generosity. So re-examined all these data across the state with fuzzy set qualitative comparative analyses. And these retain a lot more information and measures than you would see in standard qualitative comparative analysis, which mainly use CRISP sets. You can precisely calibrate measures. I'm not going to talk about how these measures are all calibrated. It's in the paper there. But and then you can kind of come up with measures of goodness of fit, or the consistency of various solutions. And you can also indicate how much the solutions, how much they cover or explain the outcome in question. And here's how the results came out. And this is the initial old age benefit generosity. And you kind of see these are the various combinations that produced it. And you can kind of see support. This first one is a very institutional politics model sort of combination. And these other 2 are both have movement factors in them. It's not as probably clean as the previous result. It indicates which states fit under each solution as well. And it's very consistent with the model, and it explains it at about 60% of it. Let me summarize this quickly. Adding public opinion to this did not really help. You can kind of see the public opinion support appears in this last solution, but the model itself is no more consistent, nor does it cover more than the previous model. And so if you compare and contrast these solutions, you can see that public opinion support doesn't really help out at all in explaining old age benefit generosity. I'm going to skip to a kind of final one here. And now we're looking at old age benefit generosity in the final period of the data. This is before the Social Security program changes again. And again, you can kind of see the long-term influence of movements here and of that initial type of politics, because simply the initial generosity really helps to explain quite a bit of what happens in generosity at the end point. So these kind of important periods of generosity, the important period when they were kind of setting up the program, influenced what happened later on. But there was at the bottom, there's another kind of route to generosity that doesn't involve it being an initially generous program. And this is a kind of a political mediation route in which you had a democratic regime in power, but the pension movement well mobilized. So even if you didn't start out initially with a generous policy, that there was still a way to get there during this period. And again, this is a pretty good model. You can see, let me conclude briefly here, that main point, and you'll be happy to see this, the previous results mainly were upheld by the new specification. And then we see institutional, political, and movement influences here as being these sort of inus causes, that they're kind of like part of combinations that are sufficient to produce a cause, and then they're necessary parts of that, but they themselves are not necessary to produce the cause. And that we see that early institutional, political, and movement influences hold up for the longer term here. So if you have this kind of this sort of key moment of change that we saw in the late 1930s, that it held up straight through to a decade plus later, even though the program itself had changed quite a bit. And not really seeing a lot of influence for public opinion here, at least measured through polls. And this could be for a lot of reasons. Maybe polls weren't taken as seriously at the time. The polls were not as good. It was very difficult, actually. We could break this down by state, how much there was public support, but I don't think Gallup broke it down for the people themselves to see. So, but it does suggest that during the formative years, at least of U.S. Social policy, it must be elsewhere, that at least public opinion through public opinion polls probably had very little to do with what happened. I have a slide here that would say thank you if I had one, but I don't. But thank you.